The morning mist clung to Millbrook like a shroud, and Margaret Thornfield moved through it as if she belonged to another world entirely. Her violet eyes, so unusual they seemed to hold secrets of their own, scanned the forest floor for the herbs she needed. The townspeople called her many things: witch, curse, devil's daughter, but never by her name. She had grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her through the market square, the way mothers pulled their children closer when she passed, the crosses that appeared on doorframes after she'd walked by. But this morning felt different. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that made her skin prickle, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change forever. As she gathered wild sage and elderflower, her fingers trembling slightly, Margaret wondered if the dreams that had been haunting her for weeks were finally about to become reality. In those dreams, she stood at an altar, but instead of facing judgment, she faced love. The very thought made her laugh bitterly at her own foolishness. The sound of desperate footsteps crashing through the underbrush interrupted her thoughts. Sarah Coleman burst through the trees, her face streaked with tears and her dress torn from running. "Maggie!" she cried, using the name that only she dared to speak. "Please, you have to help me. It's little Emma. She's dying, and Dr. Whitmore says there's nothing more he can do." Margaret's heart clenched at the sight of her childhood friend's desperation. Sarah was one of the few people who still remembered the girl she had been before the town decided she was something to be feared. "What happened to her?" Margaret asked, already gathering her herbs and supplies. "The fever came 3 days ago," Sarah sobbed. "It won't break, and now she's barely breathing. Her skin is like fire, and she won't wake up. Thomas tried everything, his medicines, his modern treatments, but nothing works. I know what people say about you, but I also know what you can do. I've seen you save sick animals, heal wounds that should have festered. Please, Maggie, she's only 7 years old." The walk to the Coleman house felt like a march to the gallows. Margaret could feel the weight of every gaze upon her as they moved through the town. Windows slammed shut as they passed, and she caught glimpses of faces peering through curtains with expressions of fear and disgust. The Reverend Blackwood stood on the steps of the church, his black robes making him look like a vulture waiting for carrion. His cold eyes followed their progress, and Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Inside the Coleman house, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of sickness and despair. Little Emma lay motionless on her bed, her small chest barely rising and falling. Her skin was indeed burning with fever, and Margaret could see the shadow of death hovering over the child like a hungry spectre. Dr. Whitmore looked up from his patient with tired, defeated eyes. "I've done everything I can," he said quietly. "The fever is too strong, and her body is too weak to fight it." Margaret approached the bed slowly, her hands beginning to warm with the strange energy that she had never been able to explain. As she placed her palms over the child's forehead, she felt the familiar tingling sensation that always preceded her healing work. The room grew silent, except for the child's labored breathing and the soft whispers of a prayer that seemed to come from somewhere deep within Margaret's soul. What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for generations to come. The fever broke within minutes, color returned to Emma's cheeks, and her eyes fluttered open. She sat up, asking for water and her mother in a voice that was weak but clear. Dr. Whitmore stared in amazement, his medical training unable to explain what he had just witnessed. Sarah wept with joy, clutching her daughter to her chest, but Margaret knew that this miracle would come with a price. As word spread through the town with the speed of wildfire, she could already hear the angry voices gathering in the street. The crowd that had formed outside the Coleman house was not there to celebrate Emma's recovery. They were there to demand answers about the woman who had saved her. "Witch!" someone shouted from the crowd. "She's made a pact with the devil. No natural healing works that fast," another voice added. "She's cursed that child, mark my words." Margaret stood at the window, watching the faces of people she had known her entire life transform into masks of hatred and fear. Among them, she noticed a figure she didn't recognize. a tall man with dark hair and kind eyes who seemed to be studying the crowd rather than joining in their fervor. Unlike the others, he wasn't shouting accusations or clutching a cross. He was simply watching, his expression thoughtful and troubled. As their eyes met across the distance, Margaret felt something she had never experienced before, a jolt of recognition, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment. The stranger's gaze held hers for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that she had almost forgotten existed. Curiosity instead of fear, interest instead of revulsion. The moment was broken by the sound of Reverend Blackwood's voice rising above the crowd. "Good people of Millbrook," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "We have seen the devil's work done in our very midst. This woman has revealed her true nature, and we must act before her evil spreads further among us." Margaret turned away from the window, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. Change was coming to Millbrook, and she could feel it in her bones. The question was whether that change would bring her salvation or her doom. As she prepared to face whatever came next, she found herself thinking about the stranger with the kind eyes, wondering if he might be the key to understanding the dreams that had been calling to her from the depths of her restless sleep. Samuel Hartford had returned to Millbrook expecting to find the sleepy town of his childhood memories, but instead he discovered a place consumed by an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that made his skin crawl. The cobblestone streets he had once run through as a boy now felt foreign beneath his feet, and the faces of neighbors who had once welcomed him with warm smiles now regarded him with the wary expressions of people who had forgotten how to trust. Standing on the outskirts of the angry crowd gathered outside the Coleman house, Samuel found himself both fascinated and horrified by the transformation that had taken place in his absence. 5 years of traveling the world, building his trading business, and experiencing different cultures had given him a perspective that his hometown clearly lacked. The woman they were calling a witch, he had seen her through the window, and what he observed was not evil incarnate, but a young woman whose eyes held a depth of sadness that spoke to something deep within his soul. "Samuel Hartford, as I live and breathe." The voice belonged to Jacob Miller, a man whose farm bordered the Hartford property. "When did you get back to town, son? Your mother's been worried sick about you gallivanting around the world instead of settling down like a proper man should." Samuel forced a smile, though his attention remained partially focused on the house where the alleged miracle had taken place. "Just arrived this morning, Jacob. I'm afraid I've walked into quite a situation. What exactly happened here?" Jacob's expression grew grave, and he lowered his voice conspiratorially. "That Thornfield woman, the witch, she's finally shown her true colors. Little Emma Coleman was at death's door, and somehow she brought the child back from the brink. But no godly healing works like that, Samuel. What we witnessed was dark magic, plain and simple." The word witch left a bitter taste in Samuel's mouth. During his travels, he had encountered many healers, wise women, and practitioners of folk medicine who were revered in their communities rather than feared. The idea that this town, his town, had devolved into the kind of superstitious hysteria that belonged to darker times made him feel sick to his stomach. "Have you considered that perhaps she simply has a gift for healing?" Samuel suggested carefully. "I've seen remarkable recoveries in my travels that had nothing to do with witchcraft." Jacob's eyes widened in shock, and he took a step back, as if Samuel had suddenly sprouted horns. "Boy, that kind of talk will get you in trouble around here. The Reverend Blackwood has been warning us about the devil's influence for months, and now we've seen proof of it. You've been away too long. You don't understand how things have changed." But Samuel was beginning to understand all too well. As he excused himself from Jacob's company and made his way through the crowd, he listened to the conversations swirling around him. The fear was palpable, but underneath it he sensed something else, a kind of excitement, as if the people were hungry for drama and danger in their otherwise mundane lives. The woman they called a witch had given them a focal point for all their frustrations and fears, and they were clinging to her guilt like a lifeline. The crowd began to disperse as Reverend Blackwood concluded his impromptu sermon, but Samuel noticed that many lingered, their eyes still fixed on the Coleman house, as if they expected the devil himself to emerge from the front door. The Reverend's words had been carefully chosen, Samuel realized, designed to inflame rather than comfort, to create enemies rather than understanding. As the last of the crowd melted away, Samuel found himself alone on the street, staring at the house where the miracle had taken place. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones, and in the sudden quiet, he could hear the normal sounds of a small town. Children playing in distant yards, the lowing of cattle, the rhythmic sound of someone chopping wood. It was strange how normal everything seemed, when moments before it had felt like the very air was charged with hatred. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of a door opening. The woman emerged from the Coleman house, moving with the careful grace of someone who knew she was being watched. In the daylight, Samuel could see her more clearly, and what he saw challenged everything the crowd had been saying about her. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was a refined, almost ethereal beauty that spoke more of gentleness than evil. Her unusual violet eyes seemed to hold depths of intelligence and compassion that contradicted every accusation he had heard. Their eyes met across the street, and Samuel felt that same jolt of recognition he had experienced earlier. There was something about her that called to him, a sense of familiarity that defied logic. Without conscious thought, he found himself walking toward her, drawn by an impulse he couldn't explain. "You're not from around here," Margaret said softly as he approached. Her voice was melodious, with a slight tremor that suggested she was as affected by their proximity as he was. "I am, actually," Samuel replied, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm Samuel Hartford. I've been away for several years, but I grew up in this town. I just returned this morning to find things rather different than I remembered." Margaret studied his face carefully, as if trying to read his intentions. Different how? "When I left, Millbrook was a place where neighbors helped each other, where people were judged by their actions rather than their reputation. What I found today was a town consumed by fear and suspicion. I watched you save a child's life, and instead of gratitude, I saw accusation. Instead of celebration, I saw condemnation." A bitter smile crossed Margaret's lips. "You've been away too long, Samuel Hartford. You've forgotten that some gifts are considered curses in places like this. Some healings are seen as proof of evil rather than good." "But that's exactly what I don't understand," Samuel said, taking a step closer. "I've traveled extensively, and I've seen healers who were revered, wise women who were consulted by kings and commoners alike. Why should your abilities be any different?" Margaret's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Samuel glimpsed the woman behind the reputation. "Because I've never been able to explain how I do what I do. Because my eyes are the wrong color, and my touch is too warm, and my knowledge comes from dreams rather than books. Because I'm alone in the world, and alone people are always suspect." "You don't have to be alone," Samuel said quietly, surprised by his own boldness. "There are people who would stand with you, who would defend you. Are you one of them?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Samuel could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Martha Hartford, Samuel's mother, was hurrying toward them with the determined stride of a woman on a mission. Her face was flushed with exertion and worry, and her eyes held a mixture of relief at seeing her son and horror at seeing him talking to the town's most notorious resident. "Samuel Hartford, what do you think you're doing?" Martha demanded, her voice sharp with maternal authority. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? This woman is dangerous, and you're standing there in broad daylight having a conversation with her like she's some normal person." "She is a normal person, Mother," Samuel replied calmly. "She's a healer who saved a child's life today. That should be cause for celebration, not condemnation." Martha's face went pale, and she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Oh, Samuel, What have they done to you in your travels? Have you lost your faith entirely? This woman is a witch, and the whole town knows it. Reverend Blackwood has been warning us about her for months." Margaret stepped back as if she had been slapped, and Samuel saw the hurt flash across her features before she could mask it. "I should go," she said quietly. "I've caused enough trouble for one day." "Wait," Samuel called out, but Margaret was already walking away, her head held high despite the circumstances. As she disappeared around the corner, Samuel felt as if something important had just slipped through his fingers. "Come home, Samuel," Martha said, her voice gentler now. "Come home and let me explain what's been happening here. Let me help you understand why that woman is so dangerous." As Samuel followed his mother down the familiar street toward his childhood home, he found himself torn between the loyalty he owed to his family and the inexplicable pull he felt toward the woman they called a witch. The town of his youth was indeed gone, replaced by something darker and more troubling than he had ever imagined possible. But perhaps, he thought, that was exactly why he had been called back at this particular moment. Perhaps it was time for Millbrook to change again, and perhaps he was meant to be the catalyst for that change. 3 days had passed since Samuel's return to Millbrook, and each sunrise brought with it a deeper understanding of how profoundly his hometown had changed. The conversations with his mother had been illuminating in the worst possible way, revealing a community that had slowly surrendered its capacity for reason to the seductive simplicity of fear. Martha Hartford spoke of Margaret Thornfield with the kind of reverence usually reserved for discussing Satan himself, her voice dropping to whispers as she recounted every supposed transgression, every unexplained healing, every moment when the woman's presence had coincided with something unexplainable. But Samuel found himself increasingly drawn to seek out his own truth. On this particular morning, he had risen before dawn and made his way to the forest path that led to Margaret's cottage, a modest structure that sat on the very edge of civilization, as if the town had pushed her as far away as possible without actually banishing her entirely. The building itself seemed to embody its owner's isolation, well-maintained but weathered, surrounded by gardens that bloomed with herbs and flowers that most townspeople would consider suspicious. Margaret emerged from her cottage just as the sun began to filter through the trees, carrying a basket and moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to find peace in solitude. When she saw Samuel waiting on the path, her steps faltered for just a moment before she approached him with the same careful grace he had noticed during their first encounter. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, though her eyes held no real conviction behind the words. "People will talk, and their talking will eventually reach the wrong ears. Let them talk," Samuel replied, falling into step beside her as she continued toward the forest. "I've spent 3 days listening to my mother explain why I should fear you, why I should cross the street when I see you coming, why I should consider you a threat to everything decent and holy in this world. But I've yet to hear a single concrete reason why any of that should be true." Margaret paused in her gathering of wild herbs, her fingers stilling on a sprig of lavender. "You want concrete reasons? I can give you those. I see things in dreams that later come to pass. I know when people are going to die before they fall ill. I can heal wounds that should fester and break fevers that should kill. I can make plants grow faster and animals trust me instantly. I am everything they say I am, Samuel Hartford, and perhaps you should listen to your mother's warnings. And I think you're extraordinary," Samuel said quietly, his words hanging in the morning air like a benediction. "I think you're a woman who has been given remarkable gifts, and instead of being celebrated for them, you've been made to feel ashamed. I think this town has confused something beautiful with something evil, and I think you've been alone for so long that you've started to believe their version of who you are." Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "You don't understand what it's like to be different in a place like this. You don't know what it feels like to have people cross themselves when you walk by, to have mothers snatch their children away from you, to know that every kind thing you do will be twisted into evidence of your wickedness. Then show me," Samuel said, reaching out to touch her hand gently. "Show me who you really are, not who they say you are. Help me understand." What followed was a morning unlike any other in Samuel's life. Margaret led him deeper into the forest, to places where her presence seemed to awaken something magical in the very air around them. She showed him how she could encourage flowers to bloom with just a touch, how birds would come to her call, how she could sense the health of trees and plants in ways that seemed to defy natural explanation. But more than that, she showed him a gentleness and wisdom that spoke of a soul that had been tested by isolation and had emerged with its compassion intact. As they walked and talked, Samuel found himself falling in love not just with Margaret's extraordinary abilities, but with the woman herself, her quick wit, her deep empathy, her quiet strength in the face of constant persecution. When she laughed at something he said, the sound was like music he'd been waiting his entire life to hear. But their peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching voices. Through the trees, they could see a group of townspeople, led by Reverend Blackwood, their faces grim with purpose. Margaret's face went pale as she recognized the look in their eyes. This was not a casual encounter, but a hunting party. "Run!" she whispered to Samuel, but he stood his ground, placing himself between her and the approaching crowd. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Samuel Hartford was about to discover exactly what his love for Margaret Thornfield would cost him. The confrontation in the forest had been swift and brutal in its efficiency. Reverend Blackwood's voice had cut through the morning air like a blade as he pronounced Margaret guilty of consorting with evil forces, his eyes blazing with the fervor of a man who believed himself to be God's own instrument of justice. Samuel's protests had fallen on deaf ears, and when he had tried to physically intervene, Jacob Miller and two other men had restrained him while Margaret was bound and led away like a common criminal. Now, 3 days later, Samuel sat in the parlor of his family home, his mother's worried face a constant reminder of how completely his world had been turned upside down. The formal charges against Margaret had been read in the town square that morning: practicing witchcraft, consorting with dark spirits, and corrupting the innocent. The trial was set for the following day, and Samuel knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the outcome had already been decided. "You have to let this go, Samuel," Martha Hartford said for what felt like the 100th time, her voice heavy with maternal concern. "I know you think you have feelings for this woman, but you must understand that what you're experiencing isn't love, it's her influence over you. Witches have ways of making men believe they're enamored when they're really under a spell." Samuel stood abruptly, unable to bear another moment of his mother's well-intentioned but misguided attempts to explain away his feelings. "Mother, I've traveled the world. I've met women of every nationality, every social class, every level of education and beauty. What I feel for Margaret has nothing to do with magic and everything to do with recognizing a kindred spirit. She's not a witch, she's a healer who's been persecuted for being different." "Then why won't she defend herself?" Martha demanded. "Why does she sit in that cell saying nothing while the evidence mounts against her? Guilty people stay silent, Samuel. Innocent people fight." It was a question that had been tormenting Samuel as well. He had tried to visit Margaret in the makeshift jail that had been constructed in the basement of the church, but Reverend Blackwood had refused him access, claiming that allowing a man to visit an accused witch would only give her more opportunities to spread her corruption. The few glimpses he had caught of her through the small window had shown him a woman who seemed to have withdrawn into herself, as if she had accepted her fate with a resignation that broke his heart. That evening, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. Using connections from his business dealings and a substantial bribe, he managed to gain access to Dr. Whitmore, who had been struggling with his own conscience since witnessing Margaret's healing of little Emma Coleman. The conversation that followed revealed truths that made Samuel's blood run cold. "I've been practicing medicine for 15 years, Dr. Whitmore confessed, his hands shaking as he poured himself a drink. I've seen fevers break and wounds heal, but never like what happened with Emma. The child was dying, Samuel. Her body temperature was high enough to cause permanent damage, and her breathing was so shallow I could barely detect it. What Margaret did defied every law of medicine I know. So you believe she's a witch? Samuel asked, dreading the answer. I believe she saved a child's life when I couldn't, Whitmore replied carefully. Whether that makes her a witch or a saint is a question for people far wiser than me. But I'll tell you this, if she dies tomorrow, Emma Coleman will grow up knowing that the woman who saved her life was executed for the crime of healing. The doctor's words confirmed what Samuel had suspected but hoped wasn't true. Margaret's gifts were real, inexplicable, and genuine. But in a town ruled by fear and superstition, being different was the same as being guilty. As he walked home through the dark streets, Samuel found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had with a wise woman in Morocco, who had told him that sometimes the greatest act of courage was not to fight against the darkness, but to stand in it and refuse to let it extinguish your light. By the time he reached his family's front door, Samuel Hartford had made a decision that would either save the woman he loved or destroy them both. Tomorrow's trial would indeed determine Margaret's fate, but it would also test whether love could triumph over fear, whether one man's courage could stand against an entire community's prejudice. As he climbed the stairs to his childhood bedroom, Samuel began to plan what might be either the most heroic or the most foolish gesture of his life. The town square had been transformed into an arena of judgment, with wooden benches arranged in a semicircle around a makeshift platform where Margaret sat in chains, her violet eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. The entire population of Millbrook seemed to have gathered for the spectacle, their faces hungry for the drama that would either vindicate their fears or challenge their beliefs. Samuel stood at the back of the crowd, his heart pounding as he watched the woman he loved face what amounted to a public execution, disguised as justice. Reverend Blackwood presided over the proceedings with the authority of both judge and prosecutor, his black robes billowing in the autumn wind as he read the charges against Margaret in a voice that carried to every corner of the square. Margaret Thornfield stands accused of practicing witchcraft, of making unholy pacts with dark forces, and of using supernatural powers to corrupt the innocent souls of this God-fearing community. When called upon to defend herself, Margaret spoke for the first time since her arrest, her voice clear but resigned. I have never harmed anyone. I've only tried to heal, to help, to ease suffering where I could. If using the gifts I was born with to save lives makes me guilty in your eyes, then I accept that guilt. Her words sent a murmur through the crowd. Some seemed moved by her dignity, while others saw her response as proof of her defiance against God's natural order. Samuel watched as faces he had known since childhood hardened with conviction, and he realized that fear had transformed his neighbors into strangers. It was then that Samuel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the morning air with a clarity that surprised even him. I have something to say. The crowd turned as one to stare at him, and Samuel felt the weight of every gaze, every expectation, every prejudice focused on him like a burning lens. Reverend Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously, but Samuel had passed the point of no return. If Margaret Thornfield is guilty of witchcraft for healing the sick, then I gladly declare myself her accomplice, Samuel announced, his voice growing stronger with each word. And if she is to be condemned for being different, for possessing gifts that we don't understand, then I choose to stand with her against this injustice. The crowd erupted in shocked gasps and angry shouts, but Samuel continued, raising his voice above the chaos. I ask Margaret Thornfield to be my wife here and now, before God and this community. If she is truly evil, then let that evil touch me. If she is innocent, then let our union stand as proof that love is stronger than fear. Margaret's eyes met his across the square, wide with disbelief and something that might have been hope. The crowd had fallen silent, stunned by the audacity of his proposal. Even Reverend Blackwood seemed momentarily speechless, his carefully orchestrated trial derailed by an act of love so unexpected that no one knew how to respond. "You fool," Blackwood finally snarled. "She's bewitched you completely. This only proves her guilt." But Samuel saw something else in the crowd's faces: uncertainty, confusion, and in some cases the beginning of doubt about the righteousness of their cause. Margaret's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, but in the profound silence of the square, every word carried clearly. "Yes," she said simply, "I will marry you, Samuel Hartford." And with those words, everything changed. The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything Millbrook had ever witnessed. With Margaret's chains removed, but the crowd's hostility still palpable, Samuel and Margaret stood before Dr. Whitmore, who had agreed to perform the ceremony when Reverend Blackwood had refused. The doctor's hands trembled as he opened his prayer book, but his voice remained steady as he began the ancient words that would bind their lives together. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God," Whitmore began, his words carrying across the silent square where the entire town watched in fascination and horror. Some townspeople had already begun to leave, unwilling to witness what they considered an unholy union, but many remained, transfixed by the drama unfolding before them. Margaret's violet eyes never left Samuel's face as they exchanged vows, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for those closest to hear. "I promise to love you despite the cost, to stand with you against whatever comes, and to use whatever gifts I possess in service of good, not evil." Samuel's response rang out with conviction that silenced even the most hostile observers. "I promise to defend you against fear and ignorance, to see you as you truly are, rather than what others claim you to be, and to prove that love is stronger than superstition." As Dr. Whitmore pronounced them husband and wife, the sky above Millbrook began to darken with clouds that had appeared with supernatural swiftness. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something that made the horses whinny nervously and the dogs howl in the distance. "A storm comes as they wed," someone whispered. "Surely this is a sign of God's displeasure." But the storm that broke over Millbrook was no ordinary tempest. Lightning split the sky with unnatural frequency, and the wind carried with it the acrid smell of smoke. Within minutes, it became clear that something far more dangerous than rain was approaching. A fire had started in the dry forests surrounding the town, driven by winds that seemed intent on consuming everything in their path. Panic began to spread through the crowd as people realized the magnitude of the threat. The fire was moving faster than any natural blaze, jumping from treetop to treetop with a hunger that spoke of disaster. Children began to cry, and men started shouting orders about evacuation routes and water brigades. It was then that Margaret stepped forward, her hand still clasped in Samuel's, her eyes fixed on the approaching wall of flame. Without a word, she walked to the edge of the square where the fire was closest, raised her free hand toward the inferno, and began to speak in a voice that seemed to carry the authority of nature itself. The fire stopped. Not gradually, not slowly, but instantly, as if it had encountered an invisible barrier that it could not cross. The wind died to a whisper, the smoke began to clear, and the threatening roar of destruction faded to silence. Margaret swayed on her feet, the effort of saving the town having drained her completely, but Samuel's strong arms caught her before she could fall. In the stunned silence that followed, even Reverend Blackwood could find no words of condemnation. The woman they had called a witch had just saved every life in Millbrook, and her first act as a married woman had been one of pure, selfless love for the community that had tried to destroy her.